They say that the land keeps secrets, that the earth beneath your feet can hold a story. But if that's true, then my Michigan farm must know it all, the laughter, the love, the whispered doubts, and the betrayals I've buried deep enough to almost forget. Almost. I'm standing in the backyard, the crisp autumn morning spreading its chill across my skin. Before me, buckets of apples sit in neat rows, their colors a riot of reds and greens against the fading gold of the grass. The air smells of earth and fruit, sharp and sweet, but even that can't cut through the knot in my stomach. I know today isn't just about apples. Today will bring the calls, and with them, the truths I've been avoiding. The sunlight dapples the yard, turning the leaves into tiny stained glass windows. For a moment, I let myself breathe it in, this fleeting beauty, and pretend everything is fine. James and I have been here for over 30 years. 30 years of early mornings, late nights, and the quiet rhythm of farm life. 30 years of building something solid, something I thought would last forever. But the cracks started showing years ago. With a sigh, I pick up my knife. The work is simple but satisfying: cut, sort, discard. Pristine apples go into one bin, bruised ones into another, and the rotting ones? Those go straight to the compost pile. As the first apple splits cleanly under the blade, I can't help but think about how it mirrors my life. The phone buzzes on the weathered wooden table beside me. Its screen lights up, displaying Natalie's name. I hesitate before answering. Natalie never calls with good news. Diane, she begins, her tone hesitant, almost apologetic. I hate to bring this up. Then don't, I cut her off, though I know it's useless. Natalie always finishes what she starts. It's James, she says, and my chest tightens. Someone saw him at the Rusty Note last night. He wasn't alone. My grip on the knife falters. With who? You know who, Natalie replies, her voice soft. Heather. Of course, it's Heather. Heather, with her flawless hair and two perfect teeth. Heather, who's half my age and twice as bold. My mouth feels dry as Natalie continues. They were sitting close, she says. Laughing, touching. People noticed, Diane. I just thought you should know. Thanks, I say flatly, cutting her off again. I don't need details. I've seen enough in my mind's eye. I've been seeing it for years. I hang up before Natalie can press further and turn back to the apples. The knife moves faster now, slicing through the fruit with sharp, deliberate motions. It's not anger, at least, not entirely. It's resignation. I've known about James's wandering eye for years. The first time I confronted him, he shrugged it off. It's nothing, he'd said. Don't make a big deal out of it. And so, I stopped making a big deal. I stopped asking questions, stopped looking for answers. It was easier that way. The second call comes an hour later. This time, it's Marcy, our neighbor. Her voice is warm but probing, as always. Diane, she begins, I wasn't sure if I should say anything, but... You've decided to anyway, I say, my tone sharper than I intended. Marcy chuckles nervously. I just thought you should know, James has been spending a lot of time in Bayfield lately. And, well, people are talking. They always are, I reply. Let them talk. But Diane. Marcy, I interrupt, my patience fraying. I appreciate your concern, but I don't need a play-by-play of my husband's indiscretions. I'm fine. She hesitates, then sighs. If you ever want to talk, Diane, I'm here. I hang up without responding. Talking won't change anything. The work stretches into the afternoon. By the time I finish sorting the last bucket of apples, my hands ache and my back is stiff. But the yard looks neat again, the compost pile heavy with discarded fruit. I sit on the porch steps, watching the sun dip lower in the sky. The air is cooler now, the golden light softening into something gentler. For a moment, I let myself believe that everything will be okay. But deep down, I know the truth. The farm may hold my secrets, but it can't bury them forever. And neither can I. The sun hung low as the late afternoon gave way to dusk, the golden light deepening into amber. I stood at the kitchen sink, washing the residue of the day's work from my hands. My reflection in the window was a ghostly outline, my tired eyes barely meeting my own gaze. James's truck rattled up the driveway, the familiar sound stirring equal parts dread and exhaustion. He came through the door like he always did, casual, indifferent, his boots leaving clumps of dirt on the freshly cleaned floor. He tossed his jacket onto the back of a chair, grabbed a glass from the cupboard, and poured himself some water without so much as a glance in my direction. "Long day?" I asked, trying to keep the bitterness out of my voice. "Busy," he replied curtly, gulping the water. His face was unreadable, his tone flat. I wanted to ask him, needed to ask him, about Bayfield, about Heather. But the words wouldn't come. What would be the point? He'd deny it, deflect, turn the blame back on me for prying. Instead, I watched him grab his keys again. "Heading to Tom's," he said over his shoulder. "Picking up some parts for the tractor." Before I could reply, he was out the door, the screen slamming shut behind him. That evening, I sat alone at the kitchen table, the only sound the faint ticking of the clock. The silence pressed in on me, heavy and suffocating. I thought of Natalie's call, of Marcy's, of all the whispers and glances I'd ignored for years. I couldn't ignore them anymore. Grabbing my coat, I got into the car and drove. The roads leading to Bayfield were quiet, the fields bathed in the last traces of daylight. My hands gripped the wheel tightly, my pulse quickening with every mile. The rusty note was easy to spot, its neon sign flickering in the dim light of evening. I parked across the street, my heart pounding as I scanned the parking lot. And then I saw it, James's truck, parked at the far end, barely visible in the shadows. I sat frozen for a moment, my breath shallow. Part of me wanted to turn around, to drive home and pretend I hadn't seen it. But something stronger, anger, maybe, or desperation, pushed me forward. Inside, the bar was dimly lit, the air thick with the smell of fried food and spilled beer. Conversations buzzed around me, but they faded to a dull hum as my eyes adjusted to the darkness. And there they were. James sat in a corner booth, leaning toward Heather with an expression I hadn't seen on his face in years. His hand rested casually on hers, his thumb brushing her knuckles as he spoke. She laughed, throwing her head back, her hair shining under the soft light. It was the way he looked at her that broke me, the warmth in his eyes, the quiet intimacy in his body language. It was everything he used to give me and hadn't in years. I stood there, frozen, my fists clenched at my sides. A group of men at the bar jostled past me, their laughter jarring me back to reality. I turned and left, the door slamming behind me, though no one seemed to notice. The drive home was a blur. My mind raced with images of them together, of James's hand on hers, of Heather's laugh. By the time I pulled into the driveway, I was trembling. Inside, the house was dark and quiet. I turned on the kitchen light, the harsh brightness a stark contrast to the shadows in my mind. James's jacket was still slung over the chair, his scent faint but lingering, cologne and something sharper, like betrayal. I grabbed the jacket and searched the pockets, my hands shaking. A crumpled receipt fell out, the name of a fancy restaurant in Bayfield scrawled across the top. Dinner for two. When James finally came home, it was late. He walked into the kitchen, his face weary but otherwise composed. "How was Tom's?" I asked, my voice deceptively calm. "Fine," he said, his eyes not meeting mine. "Got what I needed." I held up the receipt, the paper trembling between my fingers. "And what about dinner in Bayfield?" For a moment, he froze, his expression flickering between shock and guilt. Then he sighed, running a hand through his thinning hair. "Diane, it's not what you think." "It's not?" I said, my voice rising. "Because it looks exactly like what I think. Dinner for two. At a restaurant you'd never take me to. With her. She's just a friend," he said weakly, the words hollow. "Do you take all your friends to fancy dinners? Do you hold their hands? Laugh at their jokes like they're the only person in the world?" He exhaled sharply, avoiding my eyes. It's complicated. I laughed bitterly, the sound harsh and foreign in my ears. Complicated? 32 years, James. 32 years of marriage, of loyalty, of sacrifices. And this is what I get? Complicated? I didn't mean for it to happen, he said, his voice barely audible. But it did, I said, my voice breaking. And you didn't stop it. He looked at me then, his expression unreadable. I'm sorry, Diane. But his apology felt like ashes in my mouth, a poor offering for the years I'd given him. Without another word, I turned and walked out of the room, leaving him standing in the harsh light of the kitchen. Sleep didn't come that night. I lay in the dark, my body stiff with tension, the weight of James's betrayal pressing down on me. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his hand on Heather's, the easy laughter they shared, the look in his eyes, warm, unguarded, full of something I hadn't seen directed at me in years. By dawn, the numbness was gone, replaced by a simmering anger. I'd spent so long trying to hold everything together, to ignore the signs, to pretend that the whispers and glances didn't matter. But now, the dam had broken. James was already gone by the time I went downstairs, the sound of his truck fading into the distance. He hadn't even left a note. I stood in the kitchen, staring at the crumpled receipt on the counter, the name of that damn restaurant mocking me. Something snapped. I grabbed my keys and headed to Bayfield. If he wouldn't give me answers, I'd find them myself. Heather's house was easy to find, a modest ranch-style home tucked behind a row of maples. I'd seen it before, driving past with James when we were younger. Back then, it had belonged to her parents, just another house in a town I thought held no threats. I parked down the street and watched, my hands gripping the steering wheel. The driveway was empty, but her car sat in the garage, visible through the open door. I waited, unsure of what I'd do if she came out. Part of me wanted to confront her, to throw her betrayal in her face. But another part of me, a quieter, more strategic part, wanted to be sure before I made my move. Hours later, James's truck rolled into the driveway. He got out casually, glancing around before heading to the front door. He didn't knock. He didn't hesitate. He just went inside, as if he belonged there. The anger that had simmered in me all morning exploded. I got out of the car, my legs moving before I could think. My boots crunched on the gravel as I stormed up the driveway. The door was unlocked, I pushed it open, stepping into the house. James. I called, my voice echoing through the small space. Heather appeared first, her face pale with shock. She was wearing a robe, her hair damp, as if she'd just showered. James followed, his expression frozen between guilt and fear. Diane, what are you doing here? He stammered, his voice weak. What am I doing here? I spat, my voice shaking with fury. I could ask you the same thing, James. But I think we both know the answer. Heather stepped forward, her hands raised in a placating gesture. Diane, this isn't. Don't you dare, I cut her off, my glare silencing her. Don't you stand there in your robe, in your house, and tell me this isn't what it looks like. James reached for me, his hand brushing my arm. Diane, let me explain. I pulled away, my voice rising. Explain? Explain what? That you're a liar? A cheat? That you've been sneaking around with her while I've been home, holding everything together? Heather shrank back, but James stepped in front of her, his guilt twisting into defensiveness. It's not that simple, Diane. It's not that simple? I laughed, the sound sharp and bitter. Do you love her? The question hung in the air, heavy and damning. James didn't answer, his silence speaking louder than words ever could. I turned to Heather, my voice cold. You can have him. He's yours. But don't think for a second that you're getting away unscathed. The drive home was a blur, the fury burning in my chest like fire. I didn't just want to leave, I wanted him to feel the weight of what he'd done. That night, I began to plan. A week later, I put everything in motion. It started with the invitations. Shelby, my neighbor, helped spread the word. James and I were hosting a barbecue to celebrate our anniversary. Half the town was invited, friends, neighbors, and even a few of James's coworkers. The guest list wasn't about celebration. It was about humiliation. On the morning of the party, James was oblivious. He wandered in and out of the house, tinkering with his truck, completely unaware of the storm brewing. When the guests arrived, I played the perfect hostess, greeting everyone with a smile. James was caught off guard but went along with it, thinking I'd finally forgiven him. Once the yard was full, I climbed onto the porch steps, holding a microphone Shelby had borrowed from her church. "Thank you all for coming," I began, my voice steady despite the pounding in my chest. "Today, I wanted to celebrate something special. Not just my marriage, but the truth." The crowd murmured, confused. James stared at me, his smile faltering. "For 32 years, I've loved this man," I continued, gesturing toward him. "I've stood by him through everything, believing in the vows we made." But James decided those vows didn't mean the same to him. Gasps rippled through the crowd. James stepped forward, his face pale. "Diane, stop." I ignored him. "He's been lying to me for years. Cheating. Sneaking around with someone younger, prettier, someone he thought he could keep hidden. But nothing stays hidden forever." The crowd was silent now, all eyes on James. His coworkers exchanged glances, the neighbors whispered among themselves. I stepped off the porch, walking past him without a second glance. "Enjoy the party, James. It's all yours now." That night, I packed my bags. Before leaving, I wrote a short note and left it on the kitchen table. "James. You wanted her. Now you have her. But remember, the only thing more bitter than betrayal is regret. Don't call me. Don't look for me. You've lost me." With that, I walked out the door, the weight of 32 years finally lifting from my shoulders. I didn't look back as I left. Not at the porch where James had once proposed, not at the yard where we built a life together, not at the house that had held so many dreams, and so many disappointments. The gravel crunched under my boots as I walked to the car, my suitcase bumping against my leg. I paused only once, inhaling the cool autumn air, before slipping into the driver's seat and heading down the dark road. The radio hummed faintly, but I barely heard it over the rush of my thoughts. There was no plan, no destination, only a gnawing ache in my chest and a flicker of relief I hadn't felt in years. I had no idea where I was going, but I knew one thing for certain: I was done with James. The first few days were a blur of motels, late-night diners, and long stretches of highway. I stopped in small towns, places where no one knew me, where I could blend into the background. My phone buzzed constantly at first, calls from James, voicemails from Shelby and Natalie, messages I couldn't bear to read. By the end of the week, I'd silenced the phone and shoved it into the bottom of my bag. I spent my nights staring at unfamiliar ceilings, replaying everything that had led me to this moment. The betrayal was sharp, but the years of silence, of being taken for granted, were worse. James hadn't just cheated on me, he'd erased me, piece by piece, until I barely recognized the woman staring back at me in the mirror. One morning, somewhere in Indiana, I found myself in a quiet cafe, sipping coffee and watching the sunlight stream through the window. The world outside felt alive, vibrant in a way I hadn't noticed in years. "What's next for you?" a voice asked. I turned to see a waitress, her apron stained with coffee, her kind eyes studying me. "I don't know," I admitted. "But it'll be mine." The words felt strange but good, like stretching muscles long and used. By the second week, I'd reached Chicago. The city felt electric, buzzing with life and possibility. I rented a small apartment on the north side, a modest space with creaky floors and a view of the alley. It wasn't much, but it was mine. I spent my days wandering the city, discovering parts of myself I'd forgotten existed. I visited museums, lingered in bookstores, and drank wine on my tiny balcony. The pain of James's betrayal lingered, but it was no longer all. The calls and messages from James eventually stopped. But one day, months later, an envelope arrived at my new address, forwarded from the farm. His handwriting was unmistakable, scrawled across the front. I held the letter for a long time before opening it. Asterisk Diane. I don't know where to begin, but I'll try. I'm sorry. For everything. For the lies, the betrayal, the way I took you for granted. You deserved better, and I failed you. Heather's gone. She left weeks after you did. I thought she was what I wanted, but I was wrong. It wasn't love, it was an escape. But losing you made me realize what I had, and what I threw away. I don't expect forgiveness. I don't deserve it. But I hope you find happiness, wherever you are. You've earned it, asterisk. I folded the letter and placed it in a drawer, unsure if I felt vindication, sadness, or both. James's regrets were his burden to bear now, not mine. Months turned into a year. The farm was sold, the proceeds split between us. I used my share to open a small shop in Chicago, a cozy space filled with handmade crafts and home goods. The store became my sanctuary, a place where I could pour my energy into something tangible, something mine. One day, as I arranged a new display of candles, a customer struck up a conversation. His name was Mark, a soft-spoken architect with kind eyes and a quiet humor that made me smile. He lingered in the shop longer than most, eventually asking if I'd like to get coffee sometime. I hesitated, the scars of my past still tender. But then I thought of the notebook, of the future I'd dared to imagine. Coffee sounds nice, I said, my heart fluttering in a way I hadn't felt in years. As the years passed, the pain of James's betrayal faded, replaced by a quiet gratitude. It hadn't broken me, it had freed me. The woman I'd become was stronger, braver, and more alive than the one I'd left behind on that farm. And for the first time in my life, I felt whole.
Subscribe to never miss a new story and discover even more captivating tales.